The chamber goes silent the moment the verdict is read, and I feel every eye in the room turn toward the human, sitting alone at the center table. My name is Vexthal Oren, and I have served as an archivist of the Galactic Council for 11 cycles. I have recorded famines, wars, and the fall of 3 empires. Nothing I have ever written prepared me for what happened on the day the Council decided to kill a human diplomat named Ethan Cole. I was seated in the recorder's gallery, 3 levels above the main floor, when the announcement came. The presiding counselor, a tall insectoid being named Threl Kavos, rose from his seat and spoke the words that would end a species' patience forever. By unanimous vote of the ruling factions, the human representative Ethan Cole is found guilty of unsanctioned aggression against a protected species. Sentence is to be carried out within the hour. I remember my hands freezing over my recording pad, not because the verdict shocked me. Verdicts against minor species were common enough. It was the calm on Ethan Cole's face that stopped me. He did not protest. He did not beg. He simply looked up at the counselor, and for a moment, I thought I saw something close to pity in his eyes. Humanity had only been part of the Council for 6 cycles. They arrived late to galactic society, uninvited by any of the older species, discovered only when one of their scout ships stumbled into a contested border system and refused to leave without a formal introduction. At the time, most of the Council thought them curious but harmless, a young species eager to prove itself among giants. I did not share that view. I had read the sealed reports. I had seen what happened to the one species that tested humanity's patience during first contact. That report was buried so deep in the archive that most council members did not know it existed. I knew, because I was the one who filed it away. But politics is not shaped by old archivists and their warnings. It is shaped by ambition, and the faction that pushed for Ethan Cole's execution had plenty of it. The faction was led by a council member named Doran Vash, a council member from a species called the Korathi, an old and proud people who had once dominated half the western spiral before their empire crumbled under its own weight. The Korathi still remembered their former glory, and they resented every new species that rose faster than they had. Humanity, in their eyes, was an insult. A species barely out of its own solar system, granted a seat at the table meant for ancient civilizations. Doran Vash wanted to remind the galaxy exactly where humans belonged, and Ethan Cole's trial was his opportunity. The charge against him was almost laughable if you looked closely enough. A border skirmish near a disputed mining colony, one that human forces had not even participated in, was pinned entirely on orders supposedly issued through diplomatic channels. No evidence connected Ethan Cole directly to the incident. No witnesses could confirm his involvement. But the council did not need real evidence. It needed a target, and Doran Vash made sure the target had a human face. I sat through 3 days of proceedings that were called a trial, but functioned more like theater. Ethan Cole was allowed to speak only twice. The first time, he calmly explained that no human command structure had authorized the actions described in the charges, and that Earth's government had already opened its own investigation into the same incident, an investigation the Council refused to acknowledge. The second time he spoke was during closing arguments, and it was the only moment during the entire trial that made the chamber go quiet in the way rooms go quiet before a storm. He stood, adjusted the sleeve of his uniform, and looked directly at Doran Vash. "You are allowed to make this decision," he said. "I want to be clear that I understand that. What I don't think you understand is what happens after you make it." Doran Vash laughed. A few other council members laughed with him. I did not laugh. I wrote every word down exactly as Ethan Cole said it, because something in his voice told me those words mattered more than anyone in that chamber realized. The vote was called the following morning. It passed with an uncomfortable speed, as if several council members wanted the matter finished before doubt had a chance to settle in. I watched the numbers appear on the display above the chamber floor. Guilty. Sentence. Immediate. There was no appeal process offered. Humanity's status on the council was still provisional, which meant their representatives did not have the same protections granted to full member species. It was a technicality the Korathi had been saving for exactly this moment. I left the gallery that day with a feeling I could not name. Every instinct told me to write a formal objection into the record, but archivists are not permitted opinions, only observations. So I observed. I watched security escort Ethan Cole from the chamber, his expression unreadable, his posture straight, no sign of fear anywhere on him. I watched the human delegation staff, only 4 of them stationed on the council homeworld, pack their belongings from the embassy that same night, without a word of protest to anyone. No demands. No outrage. No pleading for mercy on behalf of their colleague. Just silence, and the quiet, methodical packing of files and equipment, as if they already knew the outcome before it happened. I did not understand that silence then. I understand it now, and it terrifies me more than anything I witnessed in the chamber. That evening, I was summoned to a private meeting with Threl Kavos, the presiding counselor who had read the verdict. He wanted the official historical record prepared for release before the execution took place the following morning, framing the event as a necessary correction, a message to all provisional species that the council's authority was absolute. He handed me a draft speech to insert into my report, language about maintaining order among younger civilizations, about the responsibility that came with galactic citizenship. I asked him one question before I left his office. I asked if he had read the Human Contact Archive from 6 cycles earlier, the report on the incident with the Skarn Collective. He waved the question away like an insect buzzing near his head. He told me ancient history had no bearing on modern politics, that the Skarn were gone because of internal conflict, not because of anything humans had done. I did not correct him. I am only an archivist, but I had read the sealed transmissions myself. I knew exactly what had happened to the Skarn Collective, and I knew it had nothing to do with internal conflict. Humanity had been given a choice back then, too. A Skarn fleet had crossed into what humans called their exclusion zone, testing the boundaries of a species they assumed was weak because it was new. The Skarn commander sent one message before his fleet went silent forever. The message said humans had offered him a chance to withdraw, and he had refused, believing his numbers guaranteed victory. There is no Skarn collective anymore. There is a debris field where their home fleet used to be, and there is a single line in the sealed archive describing what remained of their capital shipyards. I will not repeat what that line said. I only remember that reading it was the first time in my life I understood that some species do not measure strength the way the rest of the galaxy does. Humanity did not celebrate that victory. There was no broadcast, no declaration of dominance, nothing shared with the wider galaxy at all. The information reached the Council only because a passing trade vessel found the wreckage by accident. When Council investigators asked Earth's government for an explanation, the response they received was brief. It said only that the Skarn commander had been given every opportunity to leave peacefully, and that Earth considered the matter closed. That was 6 cycles ago. Humanity was granted a provisional seat on the Council shortly after, not out of respect, but out of caution. Nobody wanted to repeat the mistake the Skarn had made. Nobody except Doran Vash, who saw an execution as an easy way to remind a young species of its place, forgetting entirely what that species had already proven itself capable of. I walked back to my quarters that night carrying the draft speech Threl Kavos had given me, and I did not sleep. I kept thinking about Ethan Cole's calm face, about the words he spoke in the chamber, about the human staff packing their bags without protest. Somewhere far across the galaxy, on a small blue planet most council species still considered insignificant, a message was already traveling home. I did not know what that message said. I did not know what would happen once it arrived, but I understood, with a certainty that settled cold in my chest, that the council had made a decision it could never take back. The execution was scheduled for the following morning, broadcast across every council channel, as a public demonstration of authority. I was assigned to record it personally, a duty I had never wanted less in my entire career. As I walked toward the execution chamber before dawn, I passed the empty human embassy, its lights already dark, its doors sealed. A single flag remained mounted above the entrance, the blue and white banner of Earth, untouched, unclaimed, left behind like a promise that someone would return for it eventually. I did not know it then, but that flag would still be hanging there weeks later, the only piece of humanity remaining on the Council homeworld, a quiet reminder of a silence that was about to become the loudest thing the galaxy had ever heard. I reached the execution chamber just as the first light of the system's star touched the towers of the Council Capitol, and I remember thinking that whatever happened next would be the last ordinary morning any of us would ever have. I was right, though not in the way I expected. The execution chamber itself was a cold, circular room built centuries earlier for exactly this purpose, a place where the Council reminded lesser powers of consequences. Guards from 6 different species lined the walls, more security than I had ever seen assigned to a single event, as though even the council itself understood, on some instinctive level, that something about this particular execution required extra caution. Ethan Cole was led in without restraints, which surprised me. Doran Vash had insisted on that detail personally, wanting the broadcast to show a defiant human, forced to walk freely toward his fate, proof that the council feared nothing from Earth. I watched Ethan Cole's face as he crossed the chamber floor, and there was still no fear in it, only a strange, steady patience, the look of someone waiting for a clock to finish counting down, rather than someone walking toward the end of his life. He stopped at the center of the chamber, exactly where he was instructed to stand, and looked up toward the observation gallery, where Doran Vash sat with several other council leaders, watching with an expression I can only describe as satisfaction. I raised my recording pad, my hands steadier now than they had been the day before, though my mind was anything but calm. Ethan Cole spoke one final time before the sentence was carried out. His voice was quiet, but the chamber's acoustics carried it to every corner of the room. "Someone should have told you," he said, "that we do not forgive quickly, and we do not forget at all." Nobody in the chamber responded. Doran Vash simply nodded to the guards, and the sentence was carried out exactly as scheduled. I will not describe the details of what followed, only that it was swift, and that the council broadcast every second of it across their networks as intended. What the council did not know, what none of us in that chamber realized until much later, was that in the final moment before the sentence was executed, a single encrypted transmission burst outward from a small device concealed within Ethan Cole's uniform. It was brief, lasting less than 2 seconds, aimed with perfect precision toward a relay station that connected directly to human space. Council security scanners flagged the burst almost immediately, but by the time anyone understood what they were looking at, the transmission was already gone, already traveling faster than any of us could intercept, carrying a message toward Earth that none of us would learn the contents of until it was far too late to matter. I did not know what that transmission said. I still do not know exactly, even now, with everything that happened afterward laid bare in front of me, but I have spent a great deal of time thinking about it, about what a person says in the final 2 seconds of their life. What words are worth spending your very last moment to send home? I believe, though I cannot prove it, that Ethan Cole was not asking for revenge. I believe he was simply confirming something, reporting a status, closing a case that had already been decided long before the council ever convened its trial. The broadcast ended. The council chamber erupted into quiet, satisfied conversation, delegates congratulating Doran Vash on a demonstration well executed. I stood in the recorder's gallery, my pad still raised, unable to move, unable to write a single additional word. Around me, species that had feared humanity's rapid rise now seemed relieved, as if a threat had been neutralized, as if killing one diplomat had somehow proven the council's dominance over an entire civilization. I wanted to tell them how wrong they were. I wanted to stand up in that gallery and remind every delegate in the room about the Skarn Collective, about the debris field, about the message that said Earth considered the matter closed. But archivists do not interrupt council proceedings, and even if I had, I doubt anyone would have listened. They were too busy celebrating a victory that had not yet revealed its true cost. I left the chamber that evening and walked past the empty human embassy once more, the blue and white flag still hanging above its sealed doors, and for the first time in my long career as an archivist, I found myself afraid of what I would be asked to record next. I did not sleep again that night either. I kept thinking about the 2-second transmission, about where it had gone, about what waited on the other end of that signal, somewhere far across the dark, on a small blue planet that the rest of the galaxy had only just begun to understand. It did not understand at all. Word of the execution spread quickly through council space, carried by trade vessels and diplomatic channels within days. Most species reacted the way Doran Vash had hoped, with quiet approval or careful neutrality, unwilling to challenge the council's authority over a matter already decided. A handful of smaller species expressed concern in private channels, worried about setting a precedent that any provisional member could be executed on thin evidence, but none of them spoke publicly. Fear of drawing council attention kept most objections buried. I continued my duties as archivist in the days that followed, cataloging the trial records, filing the execution report, updating the historical index with the official language Threlka Voss had provided. Every entry felt hollow to me, sanitized, stripped of the truth I had witnessed firsthand. I began keeping a second set of notes, unofficial and unrecorded, anywhere in the council system, a private account of what I had actually seen and heard. I do not know why I started that habit. Perhaps some instinct told me the official record would not survive what was coming, and that someone needed to remember the truth of how it began. A week passed with no response from Earth. Then 2 weeks. Council intelligence officers monitored human communication channels closely during that period, expecting some kind of formal protest, a diplomatic complaint, perhaps even a request for compensation. Nothing came. Earth's government issued no statement. No human vessel approached council space. No message arrived condemning the execution or demanding an explanation. Doran Vash interpreted this silence as confirmation of his strategy. He addressed the full council during a session I was required to attend, praising the outcome of Ethan Cole's trial as proof that decisive action against provisional species prevented conflict rather than causing it. He suggested humanity's silence was evidence of fear, evidence that Earth understood its place within the galactic order and had chosen not to challenge it. I sat in the gallery listening to his speech, and I thought about the blue and white flag still hanging above the empty embassy, about the calm on Ethan Cole's face in his final moments, about a message he called "someone should have told you." I did not believe for a single moment that Earth's silence meant fear. I believed it meant something far more dangerous, though I could not yet explain why I believed it, only that every instinct I possessed told me the absence of a response was itself a kind of answer, one none of us in that chamber were prepared to understand. Little did I know that within the offices of Council Intelligence, analysts monitoring human broadcast frequencies had already begun noticing something strange, something none of them had reported publicly yet, something that would soon make Doran Vash's confident speech feel like the last comfortable moment any of us would ever experience again. I learned about it 3 days later, not through official channels, but through a friend of mine named Lyra Son, a communications technician assigned to the monitoring division. Lyra and I had known each other since our early training years, long before either of us settled into our current postings, and she trusted me enough to speak freely when she found me in the archive halls late one evening, her expression tight, with something I had rarely seen on her before, genuine unease. She told me that every public human broadcast channel, the ones Council Intelligence normally used to track civilian sentiment and government statements, had gone completely silent 4 days after the execution. Not jammed, not blocked, simply empty, as though every station on the planet and its surrounding colonies had been switched off at once. In their place, on a narrow band frequency that intelligence had never seen used before, a single automated signal repeated on a loop, broadcasting the same short phrase over and over, without variation. Lyra would not say the phrase aloud at first. She simply handed me a data slate with the transcript displayed on it. I read the words myself, 3 of them, repeated endlessly across every monitored frequency emanating from human space. Extermination protocol authorized. I asked her what it meant. She admitted she did not know. Nobody in her division knew. They had cross-referenced every historical record available to the Council, every prior interaction with human forces, every scrap of intelligence gathered since first contact, and found nothing that explained the phrase or gave any indication of what a protocol carrying that name might actually involve. Human military doctrine, as far as Council analysts understood it, emphasized caution, restraint, layered decision-making, designed to avoid unnecessary conflict. Nothing in their known doctrine suggested anything resembling what that repeating phrase implied. I asked her if she had reported this to the Council leadership. She told me she had, immediately, the moment the pattern was confirmed. Her superiors had reviewed the report and decided not to escalate it further, at least not yet. Doran Vash's faction held significant influence over intelligence budgets and appointments, and nobody wanted to hand him a reason to accuse the monitoring division of manufacturing a threat to justify its own funding. So the report sat quietly in a secured file, seen by perhaps a dozen people across the entire Council government, while the phrase continued broadcasting on that narrow band frequency, unchanged, uninterrupted, day after day. I did not sleep well after that conversation. I kept turning the phrase over in my mind, Extermination protocol authorized, trying to imagine what circumstances would lead a species to broadcast such a thing openly, rather than concealing their intentions the way any rational actor seeking advantage in a conflict typically would. It occurred to me, lying awake in my quarters, that perhaps the broadcast was not intended for us at all. Perhaps it was never meant as a threat directed outward. Perhaps it was simply what humans told themselves, an internal signal meant to organize their own population, and the fact that it happened to be audible to council monitoring stations was incidental rather than deliberate. That thought should have comforted me. It did not. If anything, it frightened me more, because it meant the message was not posturing, not a calculated attempt to intimidate an audience. It was simply true, spoken plainly among themselves, without any concern for who else might be listening. I decided, against every instinct of professional caution I had developed over 11 cycles of service, that I needed to understand more about what had happened during humanity's first contact with the Skarn Collective. I had read the sealed archive once, years earlier, during a routine cataloging assignment, but I had never studied it closely, never cross-referenced it against other records, never tried to understand the full sequence of events that led to a debris field where a fleet once stood. If the Council refused to take Lyra's warning seriously, then perhaps understanding the past would help me understand what was coming. I requested access to the sealed archive the following morning, citing historical research purposes related to provisional species integration, a vague enough justification that it did not raise suspicion. The request was approved within an hour, a small mercy that I suspect only worked because nobody currently in a position of authority considered old Skarn records relevant to anything happening in the present. What I found, once I had time to study the material properly, painted a picture far more detailed and far more disturbing than the single line I remembered from years earlier. The Skarn Collective had encountered a human survey vessel, operating near a system both species considered contested territory. Skarn doctrine, like the doctrine of many older species in that region, held that any unclaimed system fell under the authority of whichever power arrived first and established a presence, regardless of formal treaties. The Skarn commander, a figure named Vorlask Thayer, ordered the human vessel to withdraw immediately, threatening destruction if his demand was not met within a short window of time. The human vessel did not withdraw. Instead, its captain opened a direct channel to Vorlask Thayer and delivered a message that Council intelligence at the time recorded, but never fully understood the significance of. The message stated, according to the archive transcript, that the system in question fell within an exclusion zone Earth had unilaterally declared, following an earlier incident with a different species, one whose name had been redacted from the record I was accessing. The human captain informed Vorlask Thayer that his fleet had 30 standard hours to withdraw from the system, and that failure to comply would be treated according to what the transcript referred to only as established protocol. Vorlask Thayer, confident in the size and strength of his fleet compared to the single vessel confronting him, refused to withdraw. He believed, reasonably enough given everything known about human capability at the time, that no single ship could pose a credible threat to his forces. He ordered his fleet to advance and take the system by force, intending to make an example of the human vessel's crew as a warning against future incursions. 32 standard hours after the human captain's warning, a passing trade convoy discovered the remains of Vorlask Thayer's fleet. I have read the description filed by that convoy's captain more times than I can count, and I still find it difficult to reconcile with everything else I understood about human capability at that early stage of contact. The fleet had not been damaged in the way conventional warfare typically damaged a fleet. It had been dismantled with a precision that suggested overwhelming technological superiority, combined with a deliberate choice to demonstrate that superiority, rather than simply destroy the target as efficiently as possible. Every vessel had been disabled in a manner that left the crew intact but the ships themselves permanently unusable, a difference that Council analysts at the time debated extensively, without ever reaching a clear consensus on its meaning. When Council investigators eventually reached Earth's government to ask for an explanation, the response they received, preserved word for word in the archive, contained no apology, no justification beyond a simple statement of fact. The response said that the Skarn commander had received clear warning and sufficient time to withdraw, that Earth considered unauthorized incursions into declared exclusion zones a matter of fundamental security, and that the matter, as far as Earth's government was concerned, was now closed. I sat with that transcript for a long time after reading it, trying to understand what kind of species issues a warning, waits patiently for the deadline to pass, and then responds with such overwhelming and deliberate force, before simply closing the file and moving on without further comment. It did not match anything in my understanding of how galactic conflicts typically unfolded. Most species I had studied, my own included, tended toward escalation, toward retaliation, toward demonstrations of strength calculated to intimidate future aggressors. Humanity's response to the Skarn Collective contained none of that theater. It was simply efficient, proportionate to their own internal logic, and utterly final. I began to understand, sitting alone in that archive room with the weight of what I had just read settling over me, that the phrase Lyra had shown me, extermination protocol authorized, was not a threat calculated for effect. It was simply a description of a process already set into motion, one that would unfold according to its own internal logic regardless of anything the Council said or did in response. The only question remaining was what that process actually involved, and how long it would take before the Council understood the answer for themselves. I did not have to wait long to find out. 22 days after Ethan Cole's execution, a Karathi border outpost stationed at the edge of their territory stopped responding to routine communication checks. This was not, at first, considered unusual. Border outposts occasionally lost contact due to equipment failure or local interference, and the Karathi military dispatched a standard patrol vessel to investigate without raising any wider alarm. That patrol vessel also stopped responding within hours of arriving at the outpost's coordinates. By the time the Karathi military escalated the matter to a full response fleet, 3 days had passed, and I only learned about the situation because Lyra contacted me again, this time with a level of urgency in her voice that told me whatever was happening had moved far beyond routine intelligence monitoring. She asked me to meet her in a secure archive room, rather than speaking over any channel that might be monitored, which told me more than anything she actually said once we were face to face. The Karathi response fleet, she explained, had arrived at the outpost's coordinates, expecting to find evidence of an accident, equipment failure, perhaps a local pirate raid that had gotten out of hand. Instead, they found a single vessel of unfamiliar design, positioned motionless near the outpost, its configuration matching nothing in any Council database of known human ship classes. The outpost itself remained physically intact, its structure undamaged, its life support systems fully functional. But every Karathi officer and crew member stationed there had been rendered unconscious through means the response fleet's medical scanners could not immediately identify, their vital signs stable, their condition otherwise unharmed. Aboard the outpost's central command terminal, Karathi investigators found a single message displayed on every active screen, waiting for them. Lyra showed me the recovered image on her data slate, and I read the words myself, simple and direct, containing no threat, no demand, no ultimatum of any kind. This outpost falls within the jurisdiction of the faction responsible for the execution of Ethan Cole. Personnel have been rendered temporarily incapacitated and will recover without lasting harm. This is a notification, not a negotiation. Further contact will follow according to established protocol. The Karathi response fleet commander, uncertain how to interpret a message that contained no explicit threat, but had clearly been left by a force capable of neutralizing an entire outpost's garrison without a single fatality, ordered his ships to hold position and requested immediate instructions from Karathi High Command. High Command, in turn, contacted the Council directly, demanding an emergency session to address what they characterized as an unprovoked incursion into their sovereign territory. The emergency session convened within hours, and I was present as recording archivist, watching Doran Vash's confident composure from weeks earlier crumble in real time, as Karathi representatives described the incident in detail. He demanded to know why Council intelligence had not detected the approaching threat before it reached Karathi territory, and I watched the head of the monitoring division, a quiet reptilian delegate who had clearly been briefed by Lyra's division beforehand, calmly remind him that a formal warning regarding unusual human broadcast activity had been filed weeks earlier and had not been escalated due to what she described only as budgetary and political considerations. Doran Vash had no response to that. Over the following days, similar incidents occurred with increasing frequency across Karathi territory. Communication relays, shipyards, and military staging points found themselves visited by unfamiliar human vessels that neutralized personnel without lasting harm, left identical notification messages, and then withdrew without engaging in any further hostile action. No Karathi ships were destroyed. No lives were lost. But installation after installation went offline. Garrison after garrison found itself incapacitated and then released to recover on their own. And the pattern made one thing increasingly clear to everyone watching, including me. This was not conquest. This was not even, strictly speaking, warfare in any conventional sense the Council understood. It was something closer to a methodical dismantling of the Karathi faction's capacity to threaten anyone else, conducted with what I can only describe as surgical restraint. I remember sitting in the council chamber during one particularly tense session, listening to Karathi military officials struggle to explain how an enemy force could repeatedly bypass their defenses, incapacitate trained personnel, and withdraw without a single confirmed engagement in open combat. Nobody could offer an answer that satisfied the growing panic spreading through the chamber. Several delegates from other species began quietly distancing themselves from Doran Vash's faction during this period, requesting formal statements be entered into the record, clarifying that their governments had never supported the decision to execute Ethan Cole, and had, in fact, privately objected to the trial's proceedings from the beginning. I found this shift in tone almost as unsettling as the incidents themselves. Watching allies abandon a sinking political faction in real time, each species scrambling to ensure that whatever was coming would not be directed at them. On the 9th day of what Council records eventually came to call the notification period, something changed. A Karathi capital shipyard, one of their largest remaining military production facilities, went dark, exactly as the smaller installations had before it. But this time, when Council monitoring stations finally re-established contact with the facility hours later, the message displayed on their terminals was different from anything that had come before. Notification period concluded. Formal engagement begins. I was in the archive when word of this message reached the Council leadership, and I remember the particular quality of silence that settled over the building in the hours that followed, a silence unlike anything I had experienced during my entire career. It was not the silence of calm anticipation. It was the silence of an entire government realizing, all at once, that whatever had been happening over the previous 9 days had only been a warning, a courtesy extended, before the actual response began. I did not witness what happened next directly. My duties kept me confined to the archive during the following weeks, cataloging incoming reports as they arrived from across Karathi space, each one more difficult to process than the last. Formal engagement, as it turned out, meant something considerably more decisive than the notification period had suggested, though even then, the reports that reached my desk continued to describe an approach that felt deliberately restrained compared to what most Council military doctrine would have considered proportionate retaliation for an executed diplomat. Karathi military assets directly tied to Doran Vash's faction and the officials who had voted for Ethan Cole's execution were targeted with a precision that left surrounding civilian infrastructure almost entirely untouched. Fleets were disabled rather than destroyed outright, their crews given clear opportunities to surrender before engagement began. Opportunities that a significant number chose to accept once word spread of what had already happened to those who resisted during the notification period. Karathi leadership structures directly responsible for the vote were systematically removed from positions of authority, their assets frozen, their political influence dismantled piece by piece over the following weeks. What struck me most, reading report after report during that period, was the almost complete absence of civilian casualties throughout the entire campaign. Human forces appeared to go to extraordinary lengths to isolate their response, specifically to those directly responsible for the execution and the political apparatus that had enabled it, rather than treating the Karathi people as a whole as a legitimate target. I found this distinction difficult to reconcile with the fear that had gripped the council chamber during those early sessions, a fear that had assumed humanity's response would be indiscriminate, overwhelming, and impossible to contain. Instead, what unfolded felt closer to a precise excision, a targeted removal of a specific threat, rather than the wholesale destruction so many council delegates had quietly feared. in private conversations I overheard during that period. I remember Lyra visiting me again during the third week of the formal engagement period, this time not with urgent warnings but with a kind of quiet, exhausted relief that mirrored something I felt myself. She told me intelligence assessments had begun to shift, that analysts across multiple divisions were reaching the same conclusion independently. Earth was not attempting to conquer Karathi territory, was not attempting to establish any lasting presence within Council space at all. They were removing a specific threat, methodically and completely. And once that threat no longer existed, all available evidence suggested human forces intended to withdraw entirely, leaving the surviving Karathi population to determine their own future, without any human oversight or occupation. I asked her why, if that was true, human forces had chosen such an elaborate and costly approach, rather than simply demanding reparations or issuing a formal diplomatic protest through official council channels, the way any other species might have responded to the execution of one of their own. She considered the question for a long moment before answering, and her answer has stayed with me ever since, more than anything else I learned during that entire period. She told me that perhaps, for humanity, a diplomatic protest had never been a realistic option to begin with. Perhaps the entire framework of council diplomacy, built by species who had spent millennia negotiating, threatening, and gradually escalating disputes through careful political maneuvering, simply did not align with how humans understood consequences. Perhaps, to Earth's government, the execution of Ethan Cole had never been a matter open to negotiation at all, but rather a clear violation of a boundary they had established from the very beginning of their contact with galactic society, one they had demonstrated once already with the Skarn Collective, and had hoped, perhaps naively, would never need to be demonstrated again. I did not have a response to that. I still do not, even now, with the benefit of everything that happened afterward laid out clearly in the historical record I eventually compiled. I only remember sitting with Lyra in that quiet archive room, listening to the distant hum of the council building around us, and understanding for the first time that the galaxy I had spent my entire career documenting had just fundamentally changed, and none of us yet understood the full shape of what it had become. 3 weeks into the formal engagement period, the council received something none of us expected: recovered footage from a Karathi defense station that had managed to preserve partial sensor logs before its systems were disabled. The footage was shared with select council leadership under strict confidentiality, but Lyra had access through her division, and she brought a copy to me late one night, insisting I needed to see it for myself if I intended to keep an honest historical record of what was happening. The footage showed a single human vessel, sleek and comparatively small, next to the Karathi defense platform surrounding it, approaching a fortified perimeter that had been reinforced specifically in response to the earlier incidents. Karathi Command, according to intercepted communications included with the footage, had been ordered to engage without warning this time, having grown tired of losing installations without a single confirmed strike against the attacking force. 6 Karathi warships moved to intercept the approaching vessel, weapons already charged. No attempt at communication offered before they opened fire. What followed did not resemble any combat engagement I had studied in my years cataloging Council military history. The human vessel did not attempt to flee, nor did it immediately retaliate with overwhelming force. Instead, its shields absorbed the initial barrage with what sensor logs described as minimal energy fluctuation, as though the attack itself had barely registered as a threat worth responding to. A voice channel opened moments later, broadcasting a single message to the 6 Karathi ships, calm and measured, carrying none of the urgency the tactical situation seemed to demand. The voice belonged to a woman who identified herself only as Commander Iris Bellamy. She stated plainly that the vessels facing her had 30 seconds to power down their weapons and stand by for boarding, and that failure to comply would be treated as confirmation of continued hostile intent. I remember Lyra translating the tone of that message for me, since human vocal inflection still required careful interpretation by council linguists at the time, and she told me the recording carried no anger in it at all, nothing resembling the fury or vengeance the council had expected from a species avenging an executed diplomat. It sounded, she said, almost bureaucratic, a formality being observed rather than a threat being delivered. The Karathi ships did not comply. Their commander, according to intercepted communications, believed reinforcements were minutes away and ordered his ships to press the attack, rather than surrender to a single vessel. What happened in the following 90 seconds was recorded in full by the defense station's sensors before those sensors too went dark. I have reviewed that footage more times than I care to admit, trying to understand the exact sequence of events well enough to describe it honestly in this record. And even now I find certain details difficult to fully process. The human vessel moved with a precision that suggested every action had been calculated well in advance. Each Karathi ship disabled in turn, through means that left their hulls intact and their crews alive, weapons systems rendered inert, propulsion sections neutralized just enough to prevent pursuit or escape. Not a single Karathi vessel was destroyed. Not a single confirmed fatality occurred among their crews. Within 90 seconds, 6 warships that had opened fire with clear hostile intent were left drifting, disabled, and entirely at the mercy of a single vessel that chose not to press that advantage any further than necessary. Commander Bellamy's voice returned once the engagement concluded, addressing the 6 disabled ships with the same measured tone from before. She informed them that their vessels would be released to return to friendly territory once medical teams confirmed their crews required no further assistance, and that this act of restraint should not be interpreted as weakness, but as a demonstration of exactly how much capability was being deliberately withheld from the current engagement. I remember setting the data slate down after watching that recording for the first time, and sitting quietly in the dark of my quarters for a long while afterward, turning that phrase over in my mind. A demonstration of exactly how much capability was being deliberately withheld. It was the first time I truly understood, on a level deeper than intellectual acknowledgement, what the sealed Skarn archive had been trying to tell me all along. Humanity was not fighting the Karathi faction with everything available to them. They were fighting with precisely as much force as the situation required, and not a fraction more, restraint itself becoming a kind of statement, more unsettling than overwhelming force could ever have been. Lyra told me, during that same visit, that Council intelligence had identified a pattern across every recorded engagement of the formal engagement period. Human forces consistently avoided destroying vessels or facilities when disabling them would achieve the same tactical objective. Casualties throughout the entire campaign, according to the best estimates her division could compile, remained remarkably low given the scale of installations affected, a fact that seemed to trouble Council leadership almost as much as the earlier fear of indiscriminate destruction had. It was one thing to fear an enemy capable of overwhelming annihilation. It was another thing entirely to realize the enemy had that capability readily available, and had simply chosen, consistently and deliberately, not to use it. I asked Lyra what she thought that restraint meant, whether it suggested humanity might eventually be persuaded to negotiate a resolution before the campaign against the Karathi faction concluded entirely. She shook her head slowly, and told me she did not believe negotiation had ever been part of the plan from the very beginning. The restraint, she said, was not mercy extended in the hope of avoiding further conflict. It was simply how humanity conducted this kind of operation, when they had already decided the outcome was not open to discussion. Mercy toward individual crews, she believed, existed alongside total resolve regarding the faction those crews served, 2 things that did not contradict each other in human strategic thinking, the way they might have in the doctrine of most council species. I found myself thinking often, during those weeks, about the 4 human embassy staff who had packed their belongings and left without protest on the night of Ethan Cole's execution. I wondered whether any of them had known, even then, exactly what would follow, whether their calm departure had been born from confidence in an outcome they considered inevitable, rather than resignation to a loss they could not prevent. The embassy records had been sealed along with everything else related to the provisional human delegation once the crisis began, and by the time I thought to request access, far more urgent matters had consumed the Council's attention entirely. The formal engagement period continued for 6 more weeks after that recorded encounter, following a pattern that grew, in a strange way, almost predictable in its consistency. Installation after installation, directly tied to the faction responsible for the execution vote, was located, approached, and systematically neutralized. Karathi political leadership found themselves stripped of authority in sequence, always with the same careful distinction maintained between those directly responsible and the broader civilian population, who remained largely untouched throughout the entire campaign, apart from the disruption caused by their government's collapsing infrastructure. Doran Vash himself disappeared from public council sessions roughly 4 weeks into the engagement period. His absence never formally explained, though rumors circulated quickly through the archive halls that his personal transport had been intercepted, attempting to flee toward neutral territory. I never received confirmation of his ultimate fate, and I chose, eventually, not to pursue the question further. Some truths, I came to believe during that period, mattered less than the broader lesson their absence taught the rest of the council. By the time the formal engagement period concluded, the Karathi faction that had orchestrated Ethan Cole's execution no longer existed in any meaningful political sense. Their military assets had been reduced to a fraction of their previous strength, their leadership scattered or removed from power, their remaining fleets grounded under terms negotiated not through the council, but through direct communication between what remained of legitimate Karathi civilian authority and a small human delegation that arrived, briefly, to oversee the transition before departing just as quickly as they had come. I recorded every detail of that transition personally, watching as human representatives, calm and businesslike, handled the final administrative matters of a campaign that had reshaped an entire faction's place within galactic politics, without a single formal declaration of war ever being issued through official council channels. There had been no ultimatum delivered to the council itself, no demand for reparations, no request for an apology regarding Ethan Cole's execution. Earth had simply acted, according to whatever internal logic governed their extermination protocol, and then, once the specific threat had been resolved to their satisfaction, withdrawn entirely from the affairs of a galaxy they had never particularly seemed to want deeper involvement with in the first place. The council convened a full emergency session once the withdrawal was confirmed, and I was assigned once again to record the proceedings, this time in a chamber that felt entirely different from the one I remembered during Ethan Cole's trial. Gone was the confident posturing, the casual dismissal of a young species barely a few cycles into galactic society. In its place sat a room full of delegates who understood, finally and completely, exactly what kind of neighbor they had been sharing the galaxy with all along, and exactly how close their own factions might have come to sharing the Karathi faction's fate, had circumstances unfolded even slightly differently. Threl Kavos, still presiding despite the political turmoil that had consumed much of his authority over the preceding weeks, opened the session by calling for a formal review of council policy regarding provisional species and the protections afforded to their diplomatic representatives. Nobody in the chamber objected. Nobody suggested delay or further debate. The proposal passed within the hour, granting full diplomatic protections to any species holding even provisional council membership. Protections that would have applied to Ethan Cole had they existed at the time of his trial. Protections that existed now, I understood clearly, entirely because of what his death had ultimately cost the Karathi faction. I found a strange, uncomfortable irony in that outcome, one I recorded honestly in my private notes, even though it never appeared in the official historical record I eventually submitted. The council had granted humanity's diplomats more protection after Ethan Cole's death than it had ever offered him while he was alive to benefit from it. I do not know whether that irony would have meant anything to Ethan Cole himself, had he lived to see it. I suspect, based on everything I came to understand about human priorities during that period, that he might have considered the protection itself less important than the fact that no other provisional species would need to learn the same lesson through the same cost. In the weeks following the policy reforms, I was tasked with compiling the official historical account of the entire crisis, a project that would eventually become the foundation for how the council taught this period to future generations of delegates and archivists. I found the work more difficult than any previous assignment in my career, not because the facts were unclear, but because I understood, perhaps more clearly than anyone else involved in the compilation process, how easily this account could be shaped into something more comfortable than the truth actually was. Several senior council officials suggested language framing the entire crisis as a tragic misunderstanding, a diplomatic failure that had escalated beyond anyone's intention due to unfortunate timing and insufficient communication between council leadership and Earth's government. I refused to include that framing in my final draft. I had watched Ethan Cole stand calmly in that execution chamber. I had read the sealed Scarn archive and understood exactly how deliberate humanity's response to provocation truly was. There had been no misunderstanding. There had been a boundary, clearly established and clearly documented for anyone willing to look closely enough, and a faction had crossed it anyway, confident that the Council's authority would shield them from any meaningful consequence. I wrote the historical account as honestly as my position allowed, describing the trial, the execution, the notification period, and the formal engagement that followed with as much factual precision as the surviving records permitted. I included Commander Bellamy's recorded message in full, along with the sealed Scarn transcript that had first alerted me to the pattern humanity's behavior seemed to follow. I did not speculate about human motivations beyond what direct evidence supported, though I allowed myself, in a single closing passage, to offer an observation I believed the Council desperately needed to understand moving forward. I wrote that humanity's diplomatic patience should never again be mistaken for permission, that the calm restraint their representatives typically displayed in Council proceedings represented a choice rather than an inherent limitation, and that any species considering provocation against Earth or its interests would do well to remember exactly how quickly and completely that patience could be withdrawn once a clear boundary had been crossed. I did not intend that observation as praise or condemnation. I intended it simply as the most accurate warning I could offer, based on everything I had personally witnessed during the crisis. That passage became, over time, one of the most frequently cited lines in Council diplomatic training material, taught to every new generation of delegates before they ever set foot in a formal negotiation involving human representatives. I take no particular pride in that fact, though I understand its necessity. The galaxy had needed, for a very long time, an accurate accounting of exactly what humanity was capable of, and exactly how little that capability had to do with the calm, measured diplomacy their representatives typically displayed at the Council table. Nearly a full cycle passed before human representatives returned to the Council in any official capacity. When they finally did, I was present to record the proceedings, curious and more than a little apprehensive about what tone the returning delegation might adopt after everything that had transpired. I expected, perhaps, some measure of triumph, some acknowledgement of the demonstration their government had provided to the wider galaxy. I found nothing of the sort. The new human ambassador, a quiet, measured woman named Claire Marlowe, addressed the Council with the same calm professionalism I remembered from Ethan Cole's own conduct during his trial, offering no reference to the events of the preceding cycle beyond a brief, formal statement acknowledging the policy reforms the Council had implemented regarding provisional species protections. She thanked the Council for the reform, expressed Earth's continued willingness to participate constructively in galactic affairs, and made no mention whatsoever of the Karathi faction, the notification period, or the formal engagement that had reshaped an entire region of Council territory. I remember watching the other delegates in that chamber during her address, noting the particular quality of attention they paid to every word she spoke, a level of careful respect that had been entirely absent during Ethan Cole's own appearances before the Council. Nobody interrupted her. Nobody challenged her statements or questioned her credentials the way they had so casually questioned Ethan Cole's authority during his trial. The silence that greeted her address was not the dismissive silence of a species considered beneath serious consideration. It was the attentive, careful silence of delegates who understood, finally, exactly how much weight rested behind every word a human representative chose to speak at that table. I finished my compilation of the historical record, roughly 2 cycles after Ethan Cole's execution, submitting it to the Council archive under my own name, refusing the anonymous submission process that most archivists typically preferred for politically sensitive material. I wanted my account attached clearly to my own identity, wanted anyone who read it in the future to understand that a witness had recorded these events honestly, without the softening language officials had originally requested. The blue and white flag that had hung above the empty human embassy throughout the entire crisis was finally taken down the day Claire Marlowe's delegation formally re-established the embassy's operations, replaced with a new one, identical in design but clean and newly made, raised by human hands rather than left behind by staff fleeing in the night. I watched that small ceremony from a distance, feeling a complicated mixture of relief and lingering unease that I suspect will never fully leave me, not even now, so much time removed from the events I have just finished describing. I think often about the final words Ethan Cole spoke in that execution chamber, the quiet warning the council mistook for defiance, rather than the simple statement of fact it actually was. "Someone should have told you," he said, "that we do not forgive quickly, and we do not forget at all." I understand now, better than I ever could have during the trial itself, exactly how literally he meant those words. Humanity did not forgive the Korathi faction's decision to execute their representative on fabricated charges. But they did not act out of anger either, not in the way most council species understood anger, as a force that clouded judgment and demanded immediate, uncontrolled retaliation. Their response was patient, methodical, and precisely calibrated to the offense committed, restrained in every way that mattered, except in its absolute certainty of outcome. I am an old archivist now, closer to the end of my career than the beginning, and I have recorded a great many events during my time in service to the Council. I do not believe I will ever record anything that changed the fundamental character of galactic politics as thoroughly as the execution of a single human diplomat and the quiet, devastating response that followed it. Every species with a seat at the Council table today understands something that Doran Vash and his faction never allowed themselves to consider before it was far too late to matter. Humanity's patience is real. Their restraint is genuine, not performative, not a mask concealing weakness beneath diplomatic courtesy. But that patience has limits clearly defined by boundaries they have already demonstrated, more than once. A willingness to enforce completely, regardless of cost, regardless of how the wider galaxy might judge the proportionality of their response. I close this record with the same observation I included in my original compilation, because I believe it remains the single most important lesson any species sharing this galaxy with humanity needs to understand and remember. Never mistake their patience for permission. The quiet, measured calm you see across the council table is not the absence of resolve. It is simply resolve, choosing, for now, to remain unspoken.